Okay, we get to start talking about neuroanatomy today, which is, I think, a fun change. There are certain things I like about talking about neural conduction and what's happening at the synapses. I really think the neurotransmitters are interesting, but for me, I think these anatomical structures are fascinating, and I often find myself thinking, what role my cerebellum is playing in whatever I'm doing at the moment, or my basal ganglia, or my thalamus. And I think if you do that, you will learn this faster as it becomes relevant to you. It's kind of like what you did in that second homework assignment of applying it, but just do that with these brain structures of when are they relevant? Well, most of them are always relevant, but how are they relevant? What role are they playing in this moment? I give a lot of information, and I'm not as interested in where the location of a lot of these structures. I feel like that is important, but I'm more interested in the function of these structures. So that's really what you want to be paying attention to. So with the introduction to the structure of the nervous system, I feel like most of you have had some exposure to this at some point in your lives, but we're going to go through each piece of it. Most of our time is going to be spent talking about the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. Less time, but will also sometimes be in the peripheral nervous system, those nerves that are not in the central nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system includes the somatic nervous system. So I know I keep doing this. Soma is Greek for body. We saw this in the soma of the cell body, but now we also see it in the communicating to and from my body. And the autonomic nervous system. And I have there think autonomy. It's right there in the name that it is this very automatic system that we don't really have any conscious control over it. I have these commonly used terms that your author provides in these tables. I'll never test you on any of these. I think I have some in the third homework, but I don't put them on the exams. But I use them as if you know what I'm saying. And other people, when you read in the field, other people are going to use them as if you know what they're saying. And it's going to help to know what they're saying, what these terms are. And I usually tell people, I don't know if anybody's ever done this, to just take the time and do this. So I'm going to start with the dorsal, ventral, anterior, posterior. So usually when I think dorsal, I actually point up. It is towards the back of an animal, so you can think of the dorsal fin on a shark. But I point up because since we are bipedal, the dorsal area is towards our back, but it's also towards the top of the head. And when ventral, I have my hands and I point down next to my head because it is towards the stomach. And again, for most animals, it's just towards the stomach. But for us, because we're bipedal, it's towards the bottom of the brain. Anterior, point towards the front. Posterior, point towards the back. Superior, I put my fist up. And inferior, I put another fist up below that. So this is really talking about structures with respect to each other. So superior is going to be above another part, and inferior is going to be below that other part. Lateral, I point out away from the midline. Medial, I point towards the midline, towards the middle of the brain. Proximal, I put my fists together. Distal, I move my fists apart. So proximal is something that's located close. Distal is something that's located more distantly in the brain or in the body. Ipsilateral, I actually do this going on both sides of my hands on both sides of my head, going where I go straight on I'm communicating to the same side of the body. Contralateral, I cross over and because we're going to the opposite side of the body. And then the coronal slice, putting my hands kind of chopping it, don't really know how to say it, at the top of my head. So I split the front from the back. Sagittal slice, I usually think of that mid-sagittal slice, which they're showing here in the picture. If you go to the middle of those, you can see the corpus callosum. But you can take a sagittal slice. It doesn't have to be mid-sagittal in the middle of the brain. It can be anywhere in the brain, where we're showing part of the brain from the side, and then the horizontal plane. It's sometimes called the transverse plane. So I usually suggest, and I usually hope that somebody comes and on review day, which we're not going to have, but if somebody wants to make a little TikTok video or something and create this cheer, so something that really gets you kinesthetically remembering some of this if you don't already know it. Because for me now, I've just read them so many times, and they're used so much in neuroscience that you'll hear them a lot if you're going on in this field. Some other terms that are used quite a bit, the lamina or the laminae, or the laminae is the plural of the rows, the layers of cell bodies. We have rows, we have columns as well, perpendicular to the surface of the cortex. And when we look at a particular column, it's going to have similar properties. All the cells in that column are going to have similar properties. Tracts, I'll talk about white matter tracts, so those axons that within the central nervous system, nerves, a set of axons in the periphery, either from the central nervous system to a muscle or gland, or from a sensory organ to the central nervous system. Nucleus, cluster of neuron cell bodies within the central nervous system. A ganglion, I'm going to go ahead and use that one today quite a bit. These clusters of cell bodies, neuron cell bodies that are outside of the central nervous system. Gyrus, those protuberances, as we have those folds in the cerebral cortex, those the ones that protrude out. The sulcus, the fold or the groove, that's folding in. And then those fissures, which are the long, deep sulcus. And so people will talk about the central fissure or the calcarine fissure. And again, those are, I don't need you to know all those, but just know basically when they're being talked about, what people are saying. This is a deep, long sulcus. And if it's the central fissure, it's towards the center of the brain, of the cerebral cortex. So I think I go in the same order as your author. I always like to end with the cerebral cortex, and especially with the prefrontal cortex as really what makes us special as humans. And sometimes they go in a different order than me, but that's the order I like to go in because I like to end with what I think is the most fun. But I think we're going in the same order, and I'm going to start with the peripheral nervous system, then go to the central nervous system, communicate about the spinal cord, work our way up through the subcortical structures, and then into the cerebral cortex, and of course ending with the prefrontal cortex. So the peripheral nervous system, if you remember, is made up of the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system, where the somatic nervous system is that part of the nervous system that is communicating to and from the body. I'm going to start here with the body, but we're also going to do the face as well. So we're going to start with the spinal nerves, these nerves that leave the vertebral column and travel to the muscles or sense organs that they innervate. I'm going to use that term a few times as well, and especially when we get to movement, this innervation of what are the particular organs, muscles that I'm communicating to or from. We have cell bodies that are bringing in sensory information from outside the central nervous system. We often call these afferent axons or arriving axons. I think I've done that in this class. And they're also called dorsal root ganglia, okay, because they have their cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. They are those ganglia that are hanging out and then communicating into the central nervous system. And the dorsal root, if you remember the dorsal fin of the shark, these are coming along the back. And oftentimes, I like to make this a little bit kinesthetic. When I originally remembered this, I would put my hands up on my back and point upwards. So that sensory information is coming up to the brain through the dorsal root. We also have cell bodies that are communicating to the muscles and cells. So going out from the central nervous system, we see those cell bodies are in the gray matter of the spinal cord. and they are efferent axons, so exiting axons, and those are coming through the ventral roots. And again, I put my hands on my belly and point down, as that information is just being communicated out, and that's the kind of directionality, at least if I'm thinking about my feet, that's going, and that those are the ventral roots, or towards the stomach. For our face, we also have cranial nerves. Okay, we have the spinal nerves communicating to and from the body, cranial nerves communicating to and from the face. And at this point, all you really need to know is that there are 12 of them. And again, remember that they are bringing information in. So we'll talk at some point about the olfactory nerve, about the optic nerve. We'll talk about the auditory nerve. I think your book has it there as all together with the statoacoustic nerve. I will at some point I'll talk several times probably about the vagus nerve, but most of these nerves I won't mention again. And again, they'll be important when we talk about them. And right now you can just remember that there are 12. They are innervating the face, so bringing information in as well as taking information out to the muscles, the control of our mouths, our eye movements, all of that. The peripheral nervous system includes the autonomic nervous system, which has within it the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. That picture over to the right, if you see the nervous system, and then it branches off to the left side of the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and then the right side is the peripheral nervous system, and it gives a nice synopsis of everything that I'm saying, and most of what you probably really need to know about the peripheral nervous system. It's just the basics. And so depending on how you learn, that might be a good reference for you to have the picture. The sympathetic nervous system is this network of nerves that is really preparing us for vigorous activity. So that fight or flight mode, fight, flight, really it's fight, flight, or freeze. But you know, when we can feel our heart beating, we get sweaty, our digestion's actually going down as we are sending that energy into the skeletal muscles so that we can prepare for vigorous activity. There are these chains of ganglia just to the left and the right of the thoracic and lumbar areas of the spine. So if you look at the picture on the left, we see the cervical spine, below that the thoracic spine, then the lumbar spine, and below that is the sacral spine, which I'm also going to talk about here in a minute. But you can see that the thoracic and the lumbar areas are right next to each other, and these chains of ganglia, so if you remember, the ganglia are just those neuron cell bodies that are outside of the central nervous system. We have these chains of those that are close to each other, and so they can act in sympathy, as the sympathetic nervous system is named for. Is this vigorous activity. We want all of this to happen at one time. This picture really shows those chains of ganglia. So if you're looking at the red lines in this, and those little dots are ganglia, or our neuron cell bodies, that they are close to each other, and they're in this kind of chain right outside of the thoracic and lumbar areas of the spine. We have preganglionic axons that are entering the ganglia of the sympathetic chain, which is just the neuron axons that are bringing information to those cell bodies, and then postganglionic axons are being sent to communicate to the target organs, with some exceptions. You can see some neurons in between. So the other part of the autonomic nervous system is the parasympathetic nervous system, sometimes called the cranial sacral system. As you can see, so we have these cranial nerves and then nerves down from the sacral spine, or from the sacrum, that are leaving the spine, and we have these longer preganglionic axons now extending from the spinal cord, and those ganglia, those cell bodies, are closer to the target organs. So we have these shorter postganglionic fibers that are then communicating with those target organs. And one of the things that I think is nicely clear from this picture is how the sympathetic nervous system, we have this chain, they're close together, they are acting in sympathy, they are very dependent on one another and very linked. And the parasympathetic nervous system, we don't have that same kind of linking. It's a much more independent system. So I put the sympathetic nervous system and a synopsis of what it's doing on this slide, and then just have this awareness that the parasympathetic nervous system is returning the body to its resting state. And it's not exactly doing the opposite of the sympathetic nervous system. First of all, sometimes they are both working at the same time, depending on what our body is going through. And the parasympathetic nervous system, while it does increase digestive activity, decrease heart rate, it does not communicate to the sweat glands or to the adrenal gland, and so it's not exactly the opposite, but you can think of it as returning the body to its resting state. So the sympathetic nervous system, we see this linked kind of reaction. Everything's happening at once. We release epinephrine, or adrenaline as it's called. Blood flows to the skeletal muscles. We see piloerection, so the muscles that give us goosebumps are stimulated. We see an increase in many things. Our heart starts racing, we start sweating, we have higher blood sugar, more oxygen intake. All of this allows for increased activity if needed, whether we need to fight or flee. And of course, our pupils dilate as well. And it decreases digestive activity. It's really taking the energy from that resting state of when we're digesting, as that's a big part of what we're doing when we're resting, that it's taking that energy and moving it so that we are ready to move quickly if we have to. To some extent, I always feel this slide is a little wordier than it needs to be. If we look at the preganglionic axons of either the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system, they're releasing acetylcholine onto those neurons, onto those ganglia. And then the postganglionic axons of the parasympathetic nervous system, it's also mostly releasing acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter, whereas in the sympathetic nervous system, those terminal buttons, the postganglionic axons communicating to those target organs, are secreting norepinephrine, except a few places they are releasing acetylcholine, like at the sweat glands. Okay, so that was the peripheral nervous system. We've done some basic terms. The peripheral nervous system, this seemed like a good place to take a cut here. I'm chopping things up a little bit differently because of the tiny bit that was left of finishing up synapses. So in the next bunch of slides, I will start with the central nervous system. And here again is the picture that is a nice summary of the peripheral nervous system and most of what you will need to know about it. I think I go a little bit into more detail of the sympathetic and parasympathetic, and a little bit more detail of exactly how those dorsal root ganglia and ventral roots work. But this gives you the base. You can fill this, if you print this up large, you can fill in maybe what you need to know if you work well from pictures.